Welcome to the Smiling at the Future podcast. My name is Christy Rose, and this is my pursuit to glean practical wisdom on femininity, homemaking, finances, relationships, and singleness from the God-fearing men and women in my life. Hope you enjoy this journey with me as we learn to smile at the future. Hello and welcome back. I just want to start out today by thanking two very special groups of people that serve behind the scenes and help make the podcast what it is. The first is a group of 7 ladies who pray over each episode. They pray for the guest speakers and for those who are going to be tuning in. And their investment is challenging, and yet they persevere in serving us all in that way. And the second group I want to thank are the people who financially donate to the podcast. There are some costs to produce this show, such as website hosting and editing of each episode. So their assistance help keeps this thing going. So I just want to say thank you to those of you who pray and those who financially give. Your efforts don't go unnoticed. But shifting gears to today's episode, I have the privilege of sitting down with Cathy Olewiler, who is a wife and a mother of 6. And she and her family early on in their life were challenged to create a life purpose statement to set their family values and help guide them in their decision-making process. I thought it was such a fantastic idea that I've asked her to come and tell us all about that. So here is my conversation with Cathy Olewiler. Well, Cathy, it is such a treat to have you join me on the podcast today. And before we dive into our discussion, would you share some about yourself with the listeners today?
Well, good morning. Thank you so much. And I appreciate the opportunity to just visit with you by way of computer here on our modern technology and just share some of this with your listeners. I appreciate your podcast. It's been a blessing to myself and so many others that I know have heard it at times. And so, yes, I'm living in Bakersfield right now, not from Bakersfield, but I have been here probably about 30 years now. We have Grant, my husband, and I have moved here and have 6 children, 12 grandchildren. The 12th's on his way, I guess I should say. It's a little boy, we just found out. And yeah, so we're serving in ministry at Grace Bible Church of Bakersfield and have been involved in women's ministry for myself, particularly for quite a few years now, and just enjoy serving the Lord in the capacity that He's given me to do that and reaching women, just being able to teach Bible study and mentoring and encouraging women in their direction, as well as just both of us together in ministry. Grant is an elder, and we together have also taught parenting classes over the years. And so that's been a joy kind of to focus on ministry together in that way. So that's, a little bit about us.
That's neat. I love when couples can do ministry together and team up in that way. And your daughter, Heather, has been a guest a couple of times on this podcast as well. She came on early a couple years back to talk about awkward questions that singles receive and how to respond graciously to those. And then again, she talked about being a bridesmaid and how to do that well. So that was sweet to have her participate. And now you, who is the main woman in her life, who is sure invested in her and poured her wisdom, and now being a spiritual mother to other ladies in your church, that you and your husband have adopted something unique for your family. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. And that is a life purpose statement. I love the idea. I love just being purposeful with our time and our resources and setting a compass for our life. So I would love to hear first and foremost, if you could share what a life purpose statement is.
Sure. Well, I'm going to start with kind of there's a saying in a proverb that we've probably heard over the years. It says, if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. And I think that's kind of a good beginning, because oftentimes if we don't have a plan or some kind of a target to aim for, we're not going to accomplish what we really would like to. And I think for us, having a life purpose statement is really just setting down an actual document and having those in written so that we can see what are some of the values, what are some of the priorities and directions that we wanted to go as a family. And And it's interesting how this actually started. Many years ago, we were in a Sunday school class, and I'm going to say probably at least 25 years ago. And we were challenged by the Sunday school teacher to come up with a family purpose statement. And it was interesting because I think very few actually did the work to do that, but we found it very encouraging. We found it very interesting in that we were kind of in the thick of raising our kids. They were still young and six little ones at home and just thinking, well, gosh, what are we doing? We're spinning our wheels so fast here trying to keep up with life, but let's slow down and kind of put it through more of a practical grid as far as what is our purpose. And so that's kind of how it started in that first Sunday school class years ago. And we did end up writing it down, and I'll share a little bit about that as we continue on. But so that's, life purpose statement really just helps you to kind of have a direction. And I think for me, honestly, I attribute some of that to years ago being at Grace Community in a Bible study, I think with Elizabeth George, where she put down the priorities and having those priorities listed of, what is the priorities of our life. And I think that really started on the first track of how to think through in priority mindset.
You said something that just made me think that it's so important when we are tempted to be aimless in life. And many people live that way. They don't really know they're a believer. They know who they are in Christ. But beyond that, they are committing to many things, maybe not sure what to commit to, and kind of floating around aimlessly. And then other people end up dictating their lives because they don't know what to do. So other people tell them what to do with their time. And then that can lead to a whole host of other issues. But I'd love to hear what the rewards for setting a purpose statement have been for you and your family.
Sure. And I think just even what you just mentioned a minute ago here with that is that, oftentimes you can get either overwhelmed or overcommitted. And then, when you just are trying to do so much, or you just kind of don't feel like you really are heading in any direction that you really thought you were planning to go. And so I think really the first reward that I can think of is the word balance. I think that was something that we felt was having a family identity, a family value statement really helped determine for us just to kind of train habits and kind of think in the way that we're not going to get out of balance where we're so busy in one particular area or we're just, for example, if once we have kids, sometimes parents tend to be so involved with their children that they get off balance with their husband-wife relationship. And so or even attending church, and keeping God as their priority first. And so I think what it did for us is really helped give us a chance to kind of establish balance. And then just, I think for the word balance has always been important for us. And also the word proactive, just kind of being proactive rather than reactive in what we choose to do. Because sometimes, like you mentioned too, we can get reactive as far as saying yes to things or feeling like we just have all these things that we have to do. And sometimes you just need to slow down and think, well, is that really part of our family values? Is it something where we are going to desire, excuse me, to head in that direction? So I think that's, those words right there come to my mind. And I just mentioned the word family identity. And I think that's where we, kind of said, well, this is our family. So it's Olewiler family values. And this was something where it doesn't mean that every family is going to have these exact same family values. And so this was sort of our little private document in a sense that kind of helped us to establish the direction and look at it as a grid so that when we are asked to serve in ministry or when we're asked to, if the kids want to do an activity or maybe, go to someone's house as a friend and hang out there, we just kind of have to stop and kind of think, okay, do we have that time to do that? Is that something that is important right now? Is that something, just even the little things like those examples I just gave, or bigger things as far as, are we committed to the importance of that relation, of that order in the sense?
You said a word that I love. You said it helps you to be proactive in your life. And when you and your husband first sat down and developed this, you said you were incredibly busy with six little kids at home. So you had to set aside time to think this through and be proactive in establishing this culture for your family. So, how would you encourage me and the listeners to go about developing our life purpose statement? Are there steps or principles we should be thinking through as we sit down and we develop this for ourselves?
Sure, sure. And I think one of the things that comes to my mind is just how, oftentimes we all want to walk in wisdom. We all want to, keep learning and growing and exploring things, but we tend to sometimes get back to that default button where it's just you kind of automated, routine that we do. So I think for someone just starting, I would encourage, someone to really just stop and kind of plan a time. If you're a single gal, just sit down with your schedule, sit down with your even the Bible, and just kind of think through what is it that I am looking to accomplish. Because I think for life just goes by so fast, and when I look back thinking we did this 25 to 30 years ago, it's like, wow, this is crazy how at the time we did it, we just didn't, you think ahead but you just don't realize how fast time goes. And I think one thing that just comes to my mind is Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, of course, the other verse is following, for everything there's a season and time for every matter under heaven. And truly, there's so many seasons of our lives. And whether it's a season that, we find ourselves being busy in, home activities more, or serving parents, elderly parents, which, I'm currently have a mother who's 95 and still involved in watching over her care, even though she's in a care home. And then just still at the same time, grandchildren. Right now, I'm, busy with lots of grandchildren, and that's keeping me busy. So keeping that balanced in a sense that, everything there is a season, but not to just to try to keep that so that we're not chaos. We're not, God is a God of order. And I love the fact that Hebrews 1:12 says, but you're the same, your years have no end. And then Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I think, having someone to just kind of to sit down with some time and really establish what are my priorities and how am I going to get there. So that's kind of the theory of it. As far as practical, I think it would be, exciting to, as far as you to just take the practical step of just writing out what are some things, for example, our Olewiler family values, and I'll kind of share each one as I go here. They're very simple because at the time, we were experimenting, but what I would love to say is that these are something that are transcendent over time. They haven't changed. We can still look at this document and say, oh, yes, we still have that same family purpose. It's changed in the sense of now we are empty nesters and we don't have lots of little ones at home, or we're involved in ministry that's a little different than we were back then. And yet those values haven't changed. And for us, and I'll just share here while I'm on this topic here, but the first one was our spiritual relationship. And that we wrote many years ago, it is our desire to fill our lives with scripture and derive the moral principles out of it, creating a warehouse of values which will form the basis of all decisions, great or small. We will not let our minds be taken captive by philosophies of men, but rather renewing our minds in Christ Jesus, teaching our family by example the importance of worship, prayer, servanthood, and the use of our spiritual gifts. And, we just wrote down a few scriptural references, and that would be Colossians 2:8 and 2 Timothy 3:16, 17. I think that, that kind of was our first foundation as believers. That's what we want, God to be first. And that spiritual relationship begins with kind of how do you fulfill that in your family? So that would have been our first one. The next family values after that for us was the husband-wife relationship. And next to our relationship with God, the priority relationship will be our husband-wife relationship. We will protect this and model it in love and purity as portrayed in 1 Corinthians 13. And I think that was derived actually, as the next value, the next important identity there that we chose to put down. The next one we have down was the parent-child relationship. We will cultivate a loving atmosphere to train our children in wisdom and righteousness balanced with discipline. And we had the verses of Deuteronomy 6:4-9 and Ephesians 6:4. That whole child raising years, was something that was a really busy time. And yet we knew that we wanted to train them in righteousness. We wanted to train and discipline them and use scripture as our guide for that as well. And then beyond that, we just went on to the sibling relationship. And this is something where we always told our children, you're going to be your sibling's best friend. So we tried to really help encourage that by this number 4 here in our values was, it is our desire to place within the heart of each of our children a preciousness of others and the collective value of being a member of the Olewiler family. And our verse that we use, which actually was kind of one of our family main verses, was Philippians 2:3-4. And of course, that's doing nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but having humility of mind, thinking others more important than yourself. And I think having just knowing that if the kids were in a squabble or we had some disagreements or things were going on, we could just go back and say, this is not part of our, we want you guys to be in a relationship where you are thinking more precious of others and not just being selfish. And so just having that visual reminder of this is our family values really helped for us to kind of bring them back to this statement so that, we know scripture is profitable in teaching and training. And we know that we go to the scriptures for that process all the time. However, just having our own little family reminder, it's kind of like if your name's on the wall and you have a purpose, like years ago, a sweet friend gave us name plaques and each of the names of the children with their meanings. And so sometimes if the child was, if we were in a situation where somebody was doing something, I would remind them, here's your name on the wall and this is what it means. It means you're a truthful one or you're pure in heart. So we would kind of use that as a good verbal reminder, as, also a visual reminder to say, stay on the right track. And this is why we needed to do that. So
I appreciate how most of those points on your family purpose statement are relational. Your relationship with the Lord, your relationship with your spouse, your kids. And like you said, the values don't change, but the seasons do. And so I would imagine there's going to be especially for the women listening who are single, they're going to have maybe sibling relationships or even friendships. Maybe they could be thinking through how do they want to steward those areas of their life. And then coming back to this purpose statement, I'm sure will, be open to modification as God brings different seasons into your life. And if God brings marriage, then okay, we're going to add that new section to the purpose statement. And then maybe even if you're getting married or newly married, you could do this with your spouse too, of, okay, setting this culture for our family now, not just as an individual. But there's Reagan Rose, who has been a guest on the podcast before. He has actually written quite a bit about this topic of a life purpose statement. And in his book, Redeeming Productivity, he has his final chapter in the book is on this topic. And he addresses it from, he calls them domains of stewardship. So financial, spiritual, relational, vocational, and he kind of divides it up in that way and looks at each section and kind of sets goals and values for each of those areas. But one thing that how he talks about it, which I think is so encouraging and how a Christian should be viewing this, is he talks about it as being what do you want your well done to be about? Not just what's on your tombstone, not just what other people will say about you when you die, but what do you want God to say to you when he welcomes you into heaven? Well done, good and faithful servant. And is he going to be able to say that with the areas of stewardship that he's given you to steward? So I really appreciated that perspective because then you're not motivated just by other people, but your motivations are correct in wanting to give God glory and ultimately coming back to him. But yeah, I would recommend the book. I'd recommend that last chapter. But many of us can get sidetracked with even too many good things. So what is your counsel on how do we say no to those side issues or things that are taking us away from our purpose in life. And yeah, I just would love any of your practical wisdom on that.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, it comes back to there's different scriptures that come to my mind. One of the things James 4 talks about how our life is just like a vapor and a mist. It's here and then it's gone. And, even Ephesians 5 talks about looking carefully how we walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of our time because the days are evil. And I think oftentimes, we just kind of go by day and we forget we're really in a spiritual battle. And the battle is, we want to win others to the gospel. We want to share and be evangelists, and we want to be able to live our lives so that others see Christ in us and glorify God and ask us questions of why is it your family does this, or how come you're not doing that, or the way others are. And it really comes back to how we just need to be focused on just finding out, what is the most important priorities sometimes. I think, we all live life. We know we have to go to the grocery store. We know we have to eat well and take care of our bodies or whatever. Those are the things we all go through. And yet there's seasons that just seem to get heavy loaded, in certain times. I know, the holidays or something where we can get sidetracked and get off track. But, knowing the big picture and taking a step back of, okay, we're still on track with the values. We're still on track with relationships. And this season may be, off a bit busier, and we may be going through difficulties. And yet the challenges of that season, we know it's not staying there forever. And I think that's what trying to understand and really evaluate in that sense. Just living wisely in the sense that, we're all in that process of, pressing on to the goal of the prize of the upward call in Christ Jesus, Philippians 3:14 tells us. And just having more of the idea of just how do we do that and walking in wisdom. And so I think for me and the times we've had to do that, even just stopping and saying, okay, we need a family talk here. We need everybody, let's gather together and talk about, why are we starting to get kind of edgy with each other? Why are we having these little moments of difficulties or, I won't say fighting, but yeah, in the sense that we've had disagreements or things, and kind of stop and evaluate. Well, are we too busy with one area? Or are we just kind of overlooking another area that maybe we've ignored of, we're just not being kind to one another in our tongue or our tone of voice. And so I think that really pulls back to the values of, okay, we just need to, reevaluate in a sense. And, and obviously the Lord lays on your heart things of conviction, and we need to confess our sins and things like that. But just having that value purpose of knowing what our goal is. Our goal is to walk worthy in a manner that pleases him. And I think that's where just looking at things that we're doing and saying, are we too committed in activities, or are we too committed even in just areas of involvement that is drawing us away from our primary areas? Because those seasons change, the kids grow up and they move on. They grow up and get licenses and go off in their own activities and things like that, and eventually get married, or, if God has that for them, or moves out of the home, or whatever they are doing. And so we want those values to, we don't want to, go off the seasons in the sense that outgrow these values. We want our identity to still be in Christ and keeping that balance with him first. And so I hope, does that explain it well? It's a little,
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I'm just thinking through, how do you graciously say no to something? And there's a way to do that where you don't have to be like, I'm so busy and overwhelmed, I just can't add one more thing to my life. That's not the appropriate way to share what you're not able to take on, but maybe just say, with what God's given me to steward right now, I need to make that the focus. And, my family needs my attention. And so, maybe there's somebody else where God has that for them to take on, if it's like a church commitment or something like that. So just knowing how to approach a conversation like that by not making the person feel bad for asking, but helping them to understand that it's not from a sinful response that you're saying no, but you are just trying to be the best steward of what God has given you. And it could be that that opportunity is meant for somebody else, that it is another person's good work that the Lord has designed for them to do. So if you are in a place where maybe you have said yes to too many things and now you're just overcommitted, but you don't know what to cut, everything seems important. How would you encourage the person who finds himself in that place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we've all been there at times and we're like, whoa, what did I say yes to? I'm teaching Sunday school. I'm, serving in this, I'm taking meals, I'm doing things. And you kind of feel like you're just burnout and you don't want to be, you want to do it all, but you just are not managing anything well. And so I think there's times when, yes, you have to complete that commitment if you've made a commitment, or there's times when you say, you know what, I think I'm just going to bow out and let the leader know, or let the person I've committed something to just say, I need to take a break or take some time off. And people are understanding. I think of times when, I was trying to be able to take meals and sign up to help others when, I had lots of kids, and sometimes it could work. And sometimes it was like, what, I'm not even feeding my own family. Well, I need to stop and keep that first most important priority. So, just reality of what we commit to sometimes, and every, thing we do. But I think one of the things, just back in the word of balance, comes to my mind. And that's how, if you're in balance with these different areas of relationships, then sometimes one will overflow to the other. So, if you're doing something with hospitality, which, are one of our values here after the sibling relationship would be our outreach. And I'll just read that. I said in our statement, I said, through example, we'll strive to model hospitality and respect for all creatures created by God. We will also cultivate a desire to reach the lost with the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think outreach or hospitality or evangelism, things can happen when you're in balance in your family. Like for us, my husband is a very hospitable person, and I had to learn that it was not something natural for me right away. And so if he wanted to have somebody over, it was a little stressful at first. And then we realized, what, this is how we do this as a family, so that, for one, I'm pleasing him because I'm able to honor the husband-wife relationship by able to serve somebody else if he wanted to do that. But we involve the children, making them a part of, preparing and getting the home ready or the food ready. And then just using that also when families would come over to visit as gospel opportunities, because he had opportunities at times with work and having people who were unsaved at the house. And, it was a great way for our children to meet people from other countries, from other areas of life, and international and things like that. And yet we were doing it for a gospel purpose, and yet serving the family by being able to be a witness and just help in that area. So I think I might have gotten off topic here, but
Well, yeah, just circling back to the when you feel you're overcommitted, my thought would be, as hard as it is to have to pull back from a commitment and to have to tell somebody that, it's even harder to have other people tell you need to pull back. So if they see that you are overwhelmed and frazzled and just not balancing that responsibility, that commitment, then other people may come to you and say, look, you should probably step down from this. And that can be very humbling to experience that. So I would say, as hard as it is to yourself make that choice, I think it's easier than having other people have to tell you that yourself. And one thing that I think is at the root of some of this is the fear of man, or being a people pleaser. I think the heart issues behind overcommitment is you want to just serve others, you want to please others. So maybe it's not always a sinful thing, but then you can lead to sin by neglecting the areas you should be stewarding well. So I think just being mindful of, if you're tempted to say yes and to overcommit because you're trying to please other people, you want other people to think well of you, or you're worried of hurting relationships if you don't say yes to certain things. The fear of man is a snare. And so you need to reevaluate where you're putting your trust and hope. And if it's in other people, then that is going to be a snare for you. So you have to come before the Lord and say, okay, Lord, I'm going to fear you. The fear of God is protection. I'm going to steward wisely what you've given me and serve others with my talents and skills, but not over you and what you've given me to do.
Right.
So,
And that comes back down to pride too, because sometimes we think we can do it all. And, having someone, you mentioned a friend or someone tell you when you feel, they may see your life differently than you and saying, you're burning yourself out. You need to pull back. And for married people, it's just wonderful to have that spouse to just be able to communicate, say, this is perhaps a seasonal thing. Perhaps it's just a short season where it's going to be super busy. And for me, when our kids were young, my husband did a lot of traveling, and I knew I just had to hold on to get through those seasons because they were wasn't all the time, but there was times when he would be on a trade show or out of town for a while or something, and I knew that it would go back to normal later, but I just had to get through that busy season. But at the same time, our pride sometimes thinks we can do it all, and then we kind of realize we get burned out, we get overcommitted, and we get grumpy because now we're serving with the wrong attitude, and we kind of resent what we've committed to, and we start getting critical and things like that, negative. So I think really you just have to guard your heart, and it comes back to trusting that the Lord is sovereign. He's given us, for me, I had 6 children in 8.5 years, and that was his blessing. And and it was a very busy season when they were young. I loved it, but it was very busy. And you have to be guarding your heart so that you're not anxious or bitter or resentful of the work or, anything like that. At the same time, just to recognize this is a season, and we were going to look forward to this someday and realize what a blessing it is, at the time when you get through some of the difficult times of the sleepless nights or the exhaustion you're going through, because one day that will be done. And we kind of laugh right now, my husband and I, like, wow, how did we do it? We don't know, but thankfully the Lord gave us the strength day by day. I look at other young families and realize, wow, that was us a few years back. But God is so good. He just gives us the strength, he gives us the energy to do things. And I think really with the family purpose statement is just helping us to kind of stay on the main thing and not get sidetracked with everything that sounds good, or, just kind of remembering your relationships are most important, because you're guarding your family time. You're spending time on the things that are going to last rather than the temporal things. And, for us, just family devotions or Bible reading or prayer or things like that, you got to guard your time, because those things, all of a sudden, before you know it, no one's home, at the same time, and dinner table is on the fly. And we value those times together to realize, what, if our kids are going to be in activities, we just have to make sure that they're not, activities that are going to pull us away from the things that are most important. And, there's times when, like I said, a season where you've got a certain practice that happens to be right at dinner time, and you have to, figure out how that's going to work with the family. But you guard your time in the sense that it's important to help you through those times.
yeah. And this next question, you've talked about your husband and his leadership in helping your family with this, staying on track with this purpose statement. And, many of the listeners are single, so this is more of a storing up wisdom, as it says in Proverbs, question. But how do you encourage your spouse to lead a family in this purpose statement? Obviously, we don't want to usurp their authority and their leadership in the home. So what can you do as a helpmate, as a wife, to encourage your husband in a direction?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because I think it's something where you want to be on the same page. You don't want to be just singly doing this by yourself, but you want to encourage him. I think about just even how one of the early reasons why we also chose to do this was we started to realize that, businesses have philosophy of business statements or purpose statements. I think you even mentioned that your you started with your podcast and having some kind of a purpose statement of why you're doing what you're doing. And I think really coming to the understanding that you're doing this not just for personal gain because you want your family to be less chaos, but we're doing it to just kind of be proactive, planning ahead. And so I think the best way is really just sit down and talk about, maybe have a date night and just talk about what your desires are and why, and just kind of helping to walk through what this would look like, and how you're just trying to bring order from chaos sometimes. And maybe you're starting this where your kids are a little older and it's harder to stop and do this, but really just having the conversation and using prompting gently that you'd love to do this with him and how that can work. Women like security. I think that's important. What men kind of might have not take the lead on this as quickly, but once you explain to them and give them a chance to understand the big picture, it just helps kind of to, you're to be the helper. And so this is a great way you can be his helper by making things smoother in the family. I mean, what husband doesn't want to come home to his family that is a little more orderly than having just so much chaos? And I know for us, one of the important things for ministry, I mentioned earlier, we've been teaching parenting classes for many years, and we started when our children were young, and just having the opportunity to do that, for one, it allowed my husband to lead the class, but we did it in our homes. So we did it where people would come to our home, or if we did do it at church at times, it was something where we were doing it together. Our kids were involved, knowing that they were a part of this because, number one, they had to be the example of what we're teaching, because we had to, be able to say, this is what we're trying to work on. And they were modeling that in a sense. And then also just knowing they were a part of the ministry, so that they felt like that was part of their responsibility of, preparing themselves, of whether it's helping mom with dinner that night or cleaning up the dishes or whatever, to do that, and helping them be involved. But I think really, the long-term value is that we're using those purposes and we're putting that into action. So I think as far as getting your husband involved and seeing that there's value of whatever, maybe it's ministry that you want to serve together. Well, how do you get there? What are the steps to get there? And, whether it's being in a small group together or something like that. And, not necessarily that he has to be the leader of every activity, but it's the fact that you are there to support and give him some encouragement in that direction.
Yeah, really appreciate your emphasis on, being a helper and help me, and what that can look like and what that can do for your family and your husband's leadership too. And he may not always think of all of these things. So that's where women usually are more creative thinkers. And so like when you present it and be like, oh, that's a great idea, and they can run with it too. But another thing that you mentioned, and I've been thinking about this as well, is just how life can become chaotic without a plan and a purpose. And the more structured your life is, not in a completely rigid way, but the more you're planned and you have your domains of stewardship under control, it actually frees up more time for you to devote to other people. You see the people that are lacking discipline in their life, they're just overwhelmed by their day-to-day life, and there's no margin for ministry or other people. They're doing all they can do just to keep their head above water. And like you said, there are seasons when day-to-day life is more challenging. And I'm thinking, you mentioned being a mom of young kids, or maybe someone who has some serious health complications where, you need to just focus on the simple main things in your life. But the more that you can have a plan for your life, for your time, for your money, the more it's going to free you up to minister to others. So that should be a motivation to get these things under control, to put time into thinking thoughtfully about your life. I think you mentioned the verse in Proverbs earlier about consider your steps. And we are to think about how we're walking, what the decisions and habits we're forming, decisions we're making, habits we're forming. And how that's impacting the direction of our life. Our life is made up of small choices most of the time, but that can change dramatically over time the course of a life.
I think that was one of the things that comes to my mind too, is just faithfulness, just being faithful and not having that start stop mentality, but going through the long haul in the sense that sticking with things faithfully over the years. And one of the verses that I know I mentioned earlier, but this was one of our life verses for raising our children too, and just kind of how this impacts the whole general thought about this family purpose statement is Colossians 2:8. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. And so many times we do get so sidetracked by just the philosophies of the world, and they sound good, or maybe there's, we're giving financially to some missions and things like that, or we're involved in some activity of helping a local, whatever the community center is of volunteering our time. And yet, really we just need to keep remembering that there's philosophies everywhere. And, are these our biblical worldviews? Are they really something that is in line with what we believe? And it's just, even you mentioned about financial, it helps you kind of also evaluate, is this the best steward of our resources? Are we giving wisely to places that, have the same values? And we've had to evaluate that over the years, where maybe we were giving donations to certain places and realized, what, that's a good place, but it may not be the best. And so how can we even streamline where our directions of where we can help support financially and give to the areas that are most in line with our passion of our heart, in the sense that, what God has put in our minds, so for our family. So it kind of encompasses a lot of different things. And I think really what, just can use the word grid, it's kind of like a grid. You come back to, you put everything on this, I call it a sieve or whatever, and you shake it, and everything that the things that you don't need fall through, but the things you need stay. And the grid just kind of really helps to kind of be, again, proactive and not, reactive to what you're saying yes to or no to.
Yes. And one thing you said that I just so appreciate that you brought this out is faithfulness. It's one thing to get motivated for a temporary time and just, make some changes for a week or two, but then we drop off and our life kind of goes back to some of that chaos. But being faithful, enduring, persevering, and, that's what Christ welcomes us to heaven with. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. And we desire to hear that. And it is not our own strength and faithfulness. It is Christ who is still working in us each day, helping us to remain faithful to what he's given us to do. And another just call to abide in him and to cling to him, because he is our source for how we can be faithful. Well, Cathy, such a sweet privilege to have you on the podcast today, and just your own life and legacy now to your 6 kids who have benefited from you and your husband setting this for your family. And I'm inspired. I am excited to put this into practice for myself and, someday for a future family, and the culture that can set, and how that is over time going to impact so many other lives. So appreciate your faithfulness and your example in this. And I know it'll be an inspiration for the listeners as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to share. It's kind of one of those things I hadn't really thought through, and it's not something I share all the time, but I just love the fact that, I can encourage someone who is along the path, whether it's a young mom, whether it's a single, whether it's someone who's, realized now they've become Christian later in their life. And how do I go back? You can't go back, but you can always go forward and work on things ahead. And I think that's where, we just have to start with small steps. And one thing too, I'm just going to throw in is, don't compare yourself with other families. Don't, like you said, fear of man, just go before the Lord and truly bring your desires before the Lord and help pray about how you can implement some of these things, and how you can, just be willing to just be humble and ask for help, or just be able to understand that, this is something where we just have to think that, we are only given so much time here on this earth, and what are we going to do with it? So I think that's really what the value is, in just understanding the big picture and taking the steps to get there.
Yes. It makes me think of the parable of the talents. We're not looking at someone else who may have 10 talents and we only have 5, but God is most concerned about what we do with what he's given us. So we live for that audience of one. And yeah, comparison can kill that joy in serving Christ. Well, thank you again, Cathy. And again, just thankful for your time and preparation, your life preparation, and excited to share it.
Thank you so much, Christy. Been a pleasure.